We're just past the halfway point of this year's legislative session.
I don't know if it's technically downhill when you're over the hill, but that's when everything starts to get heated.
That's because state lawmakers are hitting crunch time. They have less than 60 days left to go and plenty of big controversial bills still in play.
And that's before we get to any May surprises.
This is when the fun starts. This is the late nights and karaoke in the hallways when there's filibustering and hours and hours and hours of sometimes the same voice speaking.
Whatever else they do, lawmakers have one task they can't avoid: pass a balanced budget and close a roughly $1 billion budget shortfall. Doing that is going to be tough.
We don't have a revenue problem in Colorado. We have a priority problem.
We'll learn a lot more about what's getting cut in the coming weeks. From education to healthcare, lots of people are going to feel the pain.
I think this is going to be a very hard year for our state. I think that's how I feel. No easy choices.
It's been a busy few months at the State House, and against our best judgment, we've been there for it all. The early mornings, the lunchless afternoons, and the late nights.
And the late nights that become early mornings.
Help.
But we have made it to the halfway point, and now feels like the perfect time to survey what's been happening so far, and to look ahead at the months to come. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics, policy, and the 2025 state legislature. I'm Benta Birkeland.
I'm Lucas Brady Woods with KUNC.
And I'm Jesse Paul from the Colorado Sun.
It's official. We are now past the first half of session.
We made it.
Woo! Not quite time to celebrate yet because, of course, being halfway done means we still have halfway to go.
Don't remind me.
And sadly, in my experience, the second half of session usually feels about twice as long as the first. The nicer the weather gets, the harder it is to stay inside that building all day, especially in the basement press office where there are no windows.
Lucas, you're welcome to come upstairs to the far superior third floor press room, which has a gorgeous view.
I can't argue with that. I may take you up on
We're
that.
keeping him.
But in all seriousness, there are a lot of big bills out there in play. Things like stricter gun laws, labor reforms, tipped wages. None of those measures have made it across the finish line yet. Some of them might not make it. They could die in one of the chambers or run into the governor's veto pen.
And at the same time, this is the point where we have to start worrying about what's still being negotiated in back rooms that might pop up and dominate the end of session.
Yes, the silence is starting to make me nervous, guys. I keep pestering all of our state lawmakers. What's left? What am I missing? We know there's still at least the immigration bill aimed at pushing back against the Trump administration. And of course, there's the budget and all of those painful choices that are going to come with it.
All that means there are lots of big debates up ahead, and I think it's a safe bet to assume we're about to have more of the same long nights we've started to expect at the end of each session.
And we are coming to this moment of truth that happens every session where we finally get to see how everyone comes down on the most controversial policies. I've been talking to Democrats and Republicans, and everyone expects the next few weeks to be long and tough, and that's just kind of how it goes. It certainly will depend on a lot of factors, but I did hear a different take from Representative Chad Clifford. He's a Democrat from Centennial. He agrees, yes, there's going to be a lot of long debates, but he was surprisingly upbeat about it.
On both sides of the aisle, you'll start to see more humor and more engagement. And even in the tense moments when things are going on the floor on a particular issue, if you were in the room watching, you'd see people chiding each other and still making light of the hard work that we have.
This is only Clifford's, second year at the Capitol?
Yes, to be young.
Yeah.
A few more sessions under his belt, and he may have a harder time feeling so rosy about it.
Yeah, I feel like I just happened upon one of the most optimistic people in the building about end of session.
Well, before we all start forwarding our mail to the Capitol, that beautiful third floor press room or that dingy basement press room, this is our chance to take a breath and take stock. We're going to recap some of the greatest hits of the first part of the session, catch up on what's happening right now under the Gold Dome, and look ahead at what big fights and legislation are in our not-so-distant future.
As we get started, I'm curious for each of you, what are your biggest takeaways so far? Has there been something that's just really stood out or been really surprising? I'd say for myself, and I feel like I'm going to jinx us here, but the first 2 months have flown by. I mean, I can't believe we're already at the midpoint.
You just jinxed it, Benta.
But I've also noticed that the temperatures seem to have dropped a bit, at least in the House. We've seen a lot of pretty bitter divisions there in recent years, especially among Democrats. But some of the more polarizing personalities have left, and the new crop of lawmakers, they just seem to be settling into a different tone. Now, I don't want to jinx that as well, but I just think there haven't been as many public tensions, at least among Democrats.
Definitely. The last few years at the Capitol have been really dominated by Democratic infighting. And while there's been plenty of friction with the governor this year, Democrats in the legislature seem to be mostly getting along thus far, at least publicly. But remember, that can all fall apart at a moment's notice. One bad night, one testy remark, the dominoes fall.
Yeah, but whatever has been keeping the peace, it's about to get a real test. The detachable magazine ban is now in the House, so there's the next of our late nights. And going into the session, I honestly didn't expect gun legislation to be such a big focus, but it certainly has been.
We talked about how sweeping that bill was when it was first introduced at the Capitol, basically a ban on a lot of popular types of firearms, but it's changed a lot since that episode.
Yeah, I'm not even sure you can call it a ban anymore. Governor Polis, as we've talked about in previous episodes, wasn't comfortable with the bill in its original form, so the backers negotiated with him until they found something he can sign off on. Under the measure in its current form, you could still sell guns that take detachable magazines, but to buy them, it would be more like getting a concealed carry permit. Buyers would have to go through vetting and get some specialized training.
I mean, those are some pretty big changes, but if it passes, which seems fairly likely at this point, it would still create some of the strictest rules around gun ownership in the country.
Definitely. And the changes haven't made opponents any less opposed. They see the bill now as, instead of just straight up taking away a right, recasting that right as more of a privilege, and they object to that too.
Moving on from policy to people, going into session and certainly months before session, I don't think surprise resignation was on anyone's bingo card, but we had that happen early in session.
Yeah, that was Democratic Senator Sonia Jaquez Lewis. She was facing an ethics investigation over accusations of mistreating her legislative aides, and just days before the conclusion came out, there she was on Facebook saying she was leaving the legislature for a new job.
Yeah, that whole thing had been building for many, many months, and then I woke up one morning and bam, it was over.
One thing that stood out to me, and I don't know if you feel the same way, Jesse, but I feel like there's previous sessions where something like that would have been kind of the talk of the session, but it just seemed like people moved on so quickly from her resignation.
I think people were happy to see it in the rearview mirror.
And I think it's worth noting before we move on, the drama that was happening right as she was going through the ethics investigation. It came out that she allegedly fabricated a letter of support.
Yeah, as part of it, Sonia Jaquez Lewis submitted all of these letters of support, and staff working on the investigation, nonpartisan staff at the legislature, couldn't verify any of the letters that she submitted, the veracity. Wow. And in fact, one former employee said categorically that she hadn't written a letter submitted by Jaquez Lewis with her name on it. She hadn't even talked to Jaquez Lewis in the past year. And so she was pretty horrified to find it in there in the committee's exhibits. So that just kind of piled onto this situation. I'd never really seen anything like it.
And I mean, this was also a really interesting early test for Senator James Coleman, who's the new Senate president.
Yeah, the Denver Democrat seems to have handled the whole situation pretty well. He kept it from blowing up, and in general, I think he's shown a pretty steady hand. I've been watching closely to see how the transition to his leadership would start, and I think everyone's given him pretty high marks.
I think so too, and he's, of the legislative leaders, the only person who's new to the role this year. And you're right, this whole thing with former Senator Jaquez Lewis could have been a real drag on Democrats as session continued. I don't think anyone wanted that. But to bring this back to something else we've talked about recently, by resigning, Jaquez Lewis's seat is now open.
Yep.
So that means Democrats in her district will be holding a vacancy committee to fill it. I love how it just all comes full circle for us. We did a whole episode on this process. But Jesse, in this case, do you know how many people are trying to vie for this position? She's in a seat in Boulder County. It's a Democratic district.
9 candidates have come forward. You think all of those late night floor debates have been bad? Well, my wife's going to forget what I look like by the time this thing is over. And that actually might be a good thing.
I think for her sake it is, yeah.
Getting back to legislation, there's another big early bill we've discussed and it's still making its way through the process, and that's the Labor Peace Act repeal. Unlike the gun bill, where supporters made some changes and potentially have the governor on board now, that is not happening right now with the Labor Peace Act, at least not yet. This is the measure that would make it easier for workers to form a union.
A big measure this year.
Definitely. It's one of the biggest measures, certainly the biggest measure for business groups. And we know that the governor isn't going to sign the bill as is, or at least he's signaled that much. And so I kind of expected some changes to be made in the Senate, but it made it through the chamber unchanged, no amendments. And we know now that they are frantically trying to work out some kind of deal to get it to the governor's desk in a form that the governor would sign. Just recently, I saw a bunch of big business and labor leaders walking into the House Speaker's office, clearly trying to work out some kind of deal on this negotiation compromise.
I mean, this is an issue that puts Governor Polis on the opposite side of most Democrats, locally and nationally. And I've heard that Democrats nationally are putting a lot of pressure on Polis.
And, he does have a record of vetoing pro-worker bills in the past.
That's right. And we may not know what happens with this bill until late in the session. With the governor signaling he's likely to veto the bill as introduced, that doesn't give business groups much reason to negotiate with Democrats on the measure. Businesses don't like it. They'd rather just see it die altogether. So I think that's complicating things.
I do think we should spend a moment on Republicans and what they've been up to this year. They've been trying year after year to present something that resonates with voters, but they just can't get much traction in the legislature.
The GOP did gain a few seats in November, but is still deeply in the minority. And I talked to the House Republican leaders, including Representative Ty Winter, the assistant minority leader, and he said, look, yeah, we're still in the minority, but they intend to make sure conservative viewpoints from lawmakers and voters are heard on the chamber floors.
I think, unfortunately, sometimes the majority gets frustrated with us. I think they would just like a clean sweep. We own the building, we're going to do this, this, and this. But at the end of the day, outside of the Metroplex, we had people elect us all over the state to come and talk about their values and what they find important in this state. And even though we're a minority in this building, our constituents are not a minority as citizens of Colorado.
I mean, Republicans' big push this session has been on affordability and crime, two issues they really see as being top of mind, not just for their voters, but for all voters.
Sounds familiar. But seriously, when you look at polling, voters consistently say that affordability and crime are their top issues. And unsurprisingly, though, when Republicans' solutions involve rolling back policies that the Democratic majority put in place, those bills aren't going anywhere. And all of this stuff is easier said than done. If Republicans want to cut revenue and roll back regulations, there are consequences elsewhere. This just really isn't that black and white.
Okay, so guns, labor, and the minority parties struggle to be heard in this pretty big Democratic majority at the State House. I think we've covered a lot of the media stuff that's come up at the Capitol at this point, and that means it's time to look at some big things still to come.
You love podcasts to keep up with the news. Now there's an easy way to find out what's happening in Colorado every day. The Colorado Today podcast is new from the same trusted source that brings you Purplish. You'll get the top stories, on-the-ground reporting, and moments of curiosity. Follow Colorado Today for the statewide news you need each weekday on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance. Every session, there are big bills you know are coming. You've heard lawmakers are working on them. Everyone's talking about them at the Capitol. They just keep not being introduced. And you wait and you wait. Somewhere behind the scenes, people are negotiating furiously.
Yes, it's the smoke-filled back room half of the session, so to speak.
Exactly. And this year, I think one of those bills that fits into this category that everyone's waiting to come out is on immigration.
Democrats have been working on this one for a while. They want to build on and expand on laws already in place that limit local law enforcement cooperation with federal immigration authorities like ICE, especially when it comes to data sharing. It's still not public, though. It just went to the governor's office, who reviewed it, and I'm hearing they're planning to introduce the bill in the Senate.
I think big picture here, you got to keep in mind that Colorado already has all of these laws that limit federal immigration authorities from working with local law enforcement. And certainly Republicans in the Trump administration have singled Colorado out on those policies. Denver Mayor Mike Johnson just went to Congress for a grilling from Colorado Republicans Lauren Boebert, Jeff Crank, Gabe Evans, a bunch of other high-profile Republicans. And I think the big question here is, if Democrats bring this bill in the legislature this year, what kind of retaliation might Republicans in the Trump administration bring to the state? They've already threatened to cut federal funding, and this is a tight budget year. We know that. We're going to talk more about it. But I think what's also interesting is that this is kind of in response to what Democrats are hearing from their voters. They want their representatives to do more. So I'm not sure how this all shakes out.
And just to add a little context there, Colorado has been at the center of this issue for a while. Trump came to Colorado and held a rally in Aurora that was very focused on immigration during his campaign for the presidency. We were there. And so I think that Colorado's already at the center of this, and this risks putting an even bigger bullseye on the state.
One thing will be interesting is to see what the stakes ultimately end up being if Democrats do have the stomach for this fight.
I don't know, but rest assured, it will be a fight. Think about all these protests that we've seen outside the Capitol. That's all kind of centered around this issue.
What else do you both think is another big thing happening behind the scenes people should be aware of?
Well, negotiations on construction defects are underway. This is really the main housing bill this session. It would basically lift some liability constrictions for condo builders constructing homes in certain price ranges, and in exchange, inspectors would have more oversight during the building process.
Oof, not gonna lie, this one sounds kind of boring.
It is boring, Lucas, but two of the biggest bills this session, this one and one on prescription drug discounts, are really boring. You're just going to have to deal with it, Lucas. You'll be okay.
Okay.
To Lucas's point here, I've been hearing lawmakers fight about construction defects, condo liability, for more than a decade. Is what they're considering this year really going to move the needle? Like, how significant is it?
I think that's kind of the multi-million or billion-dollar question. It really depends on the final version of the bill and who you ask on this issue. But yeah, this is a fight. The governor and more moderate Democrats in the legislature want to loosen the state's construction defects laws to promote building more housing that first-time home buyers might be able to buy. More liberal members, however, they want to make it easier to sue builders or at least keep the status quo.
So it's a real tension between encouraging developers to build what is considered a relatively affordable form of housing and making sure buyers aren't being taken advantage of.
Boring can still be important, Lucas, right?
You're right.
But I think it's always hard to parse out, especially around something like construction defects, depending upon what passes, what the ultimate impact is, given how long it takes to build new housing and condos, and then all the other factors that can impact the market.
We haven't really talked about one of the biggest things happening right now. The Joint Budget Committee is closing on a final package to take to the legislature. A lot of this process is taking place in public, but it's still hard to keep up with all the things they're doing here.
On that note, I'd like to take this opportunity to phone a friend because my Colorado Sun colleague Brian Randolph Eason is my go-to on all things budget at the state capitol.
Wow, I just learned Brian's middle name, so thank you for sharing that. But let's call up Brian. Although since this is 2025, we're actually going to see if we can get him on a video chat.
Brian, you there? I presume we're catching you at a calculator store or a calculator museum or something like that?
Computers and phones can do math now, right? I don't think I've had a calculator since high school.
Well, you don't need a calculator if your brain is a literal TI-83. Brian, what are the most important things we need to know about the budget right now?
So there's a couple things you need to know. The first, everyone's talking about cuts, but the budget is growing next year. We're not in a recession. It's just not growing anywhere near enough to cover the cost of everything the state planned to spend money on. Lawmakers spent the last several years trying to boost funding to things like public schools, colleges, state worker pay, you name it. But now reality is setting in. Federal funding is drying up. Medicaid costs are going up way faster than the state can accommodate because state tax dollars, as we know, are limited under the Constitution. Now lawmakers are having to decide what they can really afford going forward.
I think you're talking about Tabor. How close are lawmakers to making those decisions? I'll mention that we were taping this before the March revenue forecast comes.
Well, for the last month or so, the Joint Budget Committee has been going through each department and setting their operating budgets, but they've put off the biggest decisions until they get that final revenue forecast. That's their economist's best guess at how much money the state will collect next year to fund its operations. Once they have those numbers, they'll have to settle some big questions like how much Colorado is going to pay Medicaid providers and how much money it's putting into public schools and universities.
Okay, that makes sense, but do we know what's for sure getting cut at this point?
Well, nothing's final until the budget hits the governor's desk, of course, but the Budget Committee has voted to cut a lot of things already. Smaller programs that they just don't feel like the state can afford right now. They've cut funding for diaper distribution centers, high school scholarship programs, and apprenticeships. They've cut money for interim committees and legislative staff. They've also eliminated some programs that the legislature tried to set up but never actually did. One good example is there's this ombudsman office that was supposed to oversee judicial discipline in Colorado. These things kind of add up to $1 million here, $100,000 there. That's a lot of money for me or you, Jesse, but it's not much for a state government that has a $1.2 billion with a B spending gap. So the real savings when they come are going to be more wide-ranging, but a lot more consequential.
Diaper distribution centers. Who knew? Lucas, maybe a future job for you. Thanks, Brian. We appreciate your big brain, and please remember to charge your batteries.
I am just so glad Brian is on top of this budget stuff. And one thing I found especially interesting, what he said about how the committee is doing a lot of housekeeping, finding $1 million here and there that was allocated but not spent, really seems like something they should take care of regularly. But, lean times do push the government to be more careful about its money.
When it comes to the most significant cuts, one member of the Budget Committee told me maybe everything isn't on the chopping block. Some of it is still on the, quote, buffet table. And then another person I talked to was Vice Chair Shannon Bird. She notes that education and Medicaid make up the largest share of state spending, and they're not easy areas to cut from.
So many critical programs, and for every dollar we're spending there, which is crucial, we're not able to fund in other areas that Colorado cares about as well. We care about all of these things, and so now we are in a place where there will have to be cuts. And there isn't any way to cut over $1 billion out of the state's budget where important things don't feel some of their share of the cut.
And there are things lawmakers are trying to protect. I'll say Republicans in particular say they want to go to the mat to make sure K-12 education doesn't lose funding. As we head into these final 2 months, I think it's fair to say scheduling becomes very high stakes. The state constitution only lets lawmakers meet for 120 days in their regular session. So as we get close to the end, every day, eventually every hour counts.
Yeah, and that's where the minority party's ability to slow things down really comes into play. There's that age-old saying, the majority gets its way and the minority gets its say.
I don't know if you both agree, but the minority gets its say. I think Republican Scott Bottoms is a name that just pops to mind.
Definitely.
He's one of the most outspoken members in the legislature. He is one of the most conservative members in the entire state house. And when Republicans don't like a bill, you can expect to find Bottoms there at the microphone talking a lot.
I'm not speaking for the caucus here, but there are a handful of us in the caucus that are going to blow this thing up. We're tired. We're tired of being bullied by the Democrats. We're tired of being pushed around.
There are plenty of bills coming and already in the process that Bottoms and other Republicans are very unhappy about. There's a trans rights bill in the works and another for insurance coverage of gender-affirming care. And on top of all that stuff, as we've already discussed, there's the gun bill and the Labor Peace Act repeal.
I mean, he said blow things up. What exactly did he mean by that?
I mean, I think it's some of the tactics we recognize, not just filibustering individual bills, but also procedural delays. they could ask for the budget bill to be read out loud at length. And so it's the long bill for a reason. And he said if Republicans insist on that, Bottoms thinks it'll take about 3.5 days. And that's if the budget bill is read out loud on the floor 24/7.
Really, the only tool we have is time. We don't have enough votes. We don't have anything on our defense. So the only thing we have is time. So simple things like going in committee a long time, or going on the floor a long time, or reading the long bill at length, reading the bill right now at length. Those are the only things that we have because the Democrats don't care about our voice.
I mean, I think Democrats would push back on that a little bit. They are in the majority, so they don't have to listen to Republicans as much as they would if they were in a different situation. So I don't think it's that they don't care. I think they've tried to give Republicans a voice when they can. But usually when the minority party asks for something to be read at length or other tactics, they're using it as a negotiating tactic. Is he trying to win some kind of concession here?
It seems like with Bottoms in particular, it's less a negotiating tactic, but other Republicans may see it that way. And this is where inter-party dynamics come in. So let's say Bottoms or another member can call for a bill to be read at length. It just takes one person asking and making that request. Then the fight might be as much between Republicans as with Democrats.
Yeah, but the blabbermouth strategy has its limits. There are tactics and caveats that are involved here that Democrats can deploy to limit debate.
But they can't stop Republicans from having bills read at length, can they?
They cannot, that is correct. However, under some new House rules, if you ask for a bill to be read at length, you have to stay in the chamber while it's being read. You can only leave for short periods of time, something like 5 minutes, and I call that the pee-pee-poo-poo clause. That's a technical term.
Oh, God, Jesse, you are a child. But we love it. And I think it's hard to believe that Bottoms will stay in the chamber for multiple days without leaving for, bathroom breaks.
Maybe they'll bring in porta potties.
Well, I mean, Bottoms did say he doesn't speak for his caucus. And Rose Puglisi is the House Minority Leader. And she says delays and the type of tactics her party may use will largely depend on what Democrats bring forward and how Democrats manage the House floor schedule.
Are we actually bringing bills forward that actually help the people of Colorado? I think those are the conversations, and I think that's going to dictate the type of legislation that is still yet to come that we haven't seen yet. I think a lot of that's going to dictate what our floor plan winds up being, and every day is different, every bill is different, and so it is very much a case-by-case basis.
This always seems to be the tension for the minority party. In the absence of the voting power to push forward your policies, how much do you protest or vocalize your disdain for what the majority party is doing? Mm-hmm. And when is it time to chill on the objection so it doesn't look like you're being obstructionist just for the sake of it?
True. And I kind of found it interesting to talk to one of the more progressive Democrats who said she's totally fine with any of the GOP delay tactics. Representative Lorena Garcia, she's from Adams County, and she says she fully expects Republicans to bring out all these tactics on some of her bills that she's sponsoring, including her measure to increase protections for transgender Coloradans.
I mean, this is a game of chess. The rules exist. Nobody should be angry for anyone using the rules to their advantage. That's part of this chessboard. And I don't get angry when they call a bill to be read at length. I don't get angry when they filibuster and say the same thing over and over and over again. That's the tools they have. We should also use the tools we have to do the work that we were sent here to do.
I think where it'll get tricky or contentious will be issues of decorum and how lawmakers talk about sensitive and controversial issues, what they actually can say on the floor.
For sure. And that's where this maybe isn't so much a game of chess as so much a game of Twister or checkers or something rowdier. Keeping the decorum has been a very tricky thing for the House to manage in particular in recent years. Republicans are really pushing the boundaries on what they're saying, how they're fighting back against bills, and there are some Democratic members who want their leadership to keep things more on an even keel. There have even been calls for some kind of sanctions against Republicans who they feel go too far.
The end is in sight, at least for this episode. Sorry, not for session yet. But I wanted to go out on a lightning round. What else are you keeping an eye on?
Assisted reproduction. There's that bill that would roll back Colorado's first-in-the-nation disclosure requirements for sperm banks and sperm donors. It's pitting some big-name Democrats against each other on a high-profile and sensitive issue. I am definitely keeping tabs on that.
For me, it's AI. I'm waiting for legislation on artificial intelligence, trying to fine-tune policies to prevent discrimination by AI systems.
And we mentioned this earlier, but I'm really trying to keep a close eye on what happens with the immigration bill and what lawmakers actually end up trying to do with that once it's introduced.
What about vacancy process reform? Anyone? Jesse?
I am so here for it, Benta.
Nerd.
There's also the Colorado Voting Rights Act, there's tipped wages,
grocery price gouging, name image licensing for college athletes.
And you cannot forget about the state mushroom.
The state mushroom.
Woohoo!
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Lucas Brady Woods.
I'm Benta Birkland.
And I'm Jesse Paul. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf. This episode was edited by Megan Verlee and sound designed and engineered by Shane Rumsey. Our theme music is by Brad Turner.
Purplish will be back in your feeds next week. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
Guys, it's Brian. Do you have more budget questions? You guys never hung up. Hello?